I'm Adam Shostack, and today I want to share with you some work that Yuri has been leading at CyberGreen for 6 years now. The Internet Infrastructure Health Metrics Framework. And I've been working on this with her and Arastu and others for the past several years. And I'm pretty excited about what the project represents, what we're already able to see, and what we're going to be looking at. And so I want to give you an overview of the project. And the way I want to do this is I want to start out with some strategy, talk about what we're doing and why, talk about the work we've done to date, and then share some future plans. And so the Internet Infrastructure Health Metrics Framework is a set of models that measure and score internet health. And so we really have two primary lenses that we look through for the project. One is internet infrastructure, and the other is a country-by-country lens. And I'll talk about why that's so valuable to us in more detail. But overall, the thing we'd like countries to be able to do, policymakers to be able to do, is think about their overall risk. Think about how that's changing over time, both in the near term, are things altering their risk profile in various ways? And in the long term, are they trending in the right direction? Are the policy interventions they're making having the effect that they hope they will have? And the other thing that we want them to be able to do is actually compare to other countries. Competition is a lovely motivator. Everyone would like to be in the top part of the league tables in various ways, and giving them an ability to assess what they're doing is important. And the other the other underlying goal of the project is to exercise the public health metaphors, the frameworks that we've been talking about, because frankly, a lot of the way in which internet security is framed today is about interstate competition, it's about military, it's about espionage. And we think that there is an important role for public health metaphors to play. And the best way to give them a chance to play is by making them concrete, demonstrating them to people making decisions, and seeing if we can meet their needs in a way, meets some set of needs better than other metaphors can. And so we do a lot of scoring, and we plan to do a lot more. And our reasoning is that scores are a powerful motivating force. When you give someone a score, they respond to it. When you give them a grade, they respond. And scores are also really helpful when people are skimming rather than deep diving. And I don't want to characterize policymakers in any sort of way when I'm being recorded. But the reality is most policymakers are fairly busy people, and having something that's easily graspable as the outcome of the work is an important feature of the work. And it's really important to understand that good scoring requires design by experts to serve some sort of goal, right? What are we measuring? Why are we measuring those things? How do they tie to the outcomes that we care about? Because if, that just, I think I'm going to get tautological in a minute. So I'll just say we need to think carefully about our scoring design. And we're pretty early in that process right now. So one of the key goals of scoring is to measure populations, not individuals. And this is something Dan Gear talked about back in February, is the distinction that public health is focused on the public, not on individuals. And so this differs from a lot of the work that organizations do to assess. For example, we might adopt third-party risk measures, but those are really focused on enterprises more than they are individuals. And so we think here about things like the infrastructure, the public core, and the various ways we define that. Oh, hey, Art, good to see you. We think about elements that require coordination, things like routing, right? BGPsec is not useful in and of itself if only CyberGreen, for example, were to be issuing signed routes. We need other people to also be issuing signed routes. We need people to be validating those. And so that need for coordination is the sort of thing that a public health framing can help us find. Another piece that we really care about is elements with outsized impact on others. So for example, you might not care about your site being configured in a way that allows it to DDoS others because it's really harm to other people, and you're more concerned about people breaking in and stealing your information. But at a population level, this starts to matter a lot, because if we have no way to think about the impact of our systems on others, and we don't have scores and other elements that help people see that those problems exist, they're much less likely to be managed effectively. And so we think about scoring in these ways to help draw attention to problems that otherwise are less visible. And so I'm going to shift our attention to what we've done. And so this section is on the work we've done to date through the end of 2022. This work has all been stage setting. It's been preliminary. Some of it is available via the CyberGreen website, but a lot of what we're going to show you today are things that we've been working on in private. And so this is actually the first time anyone will see them. We've been sharing a lot of this with our sponsor Area, who's been a great help in getting this work to where it is. And so what we're looking at today, what we call cleverly phase 2 of the project, is 3 sets of things. And it's weekly global scans for 5 open services: DNS, NTP, SNMP, SSDP, and CardGen, each of which acts as an effective amplifier for DNS distributed denial of service attacks. And so we're measuring those, where we've added in, and so that was phase 1. In phase 2, we added in routing security, we added in DNS health and security, and we're scanning across the entire IP4 space. We're scanning across the entire set of autonomous systems used in internet routing. And since the question sometimes comes up, we are not yet doing IP6 scanning. There's a bunch of complex technical things that make that's actually not complex. The IP6 space is really big. Scanning it is more complex than scanning IP4. And so what we're measuring, I mentioned denial of service, DNS security. We're measuring DNS security in a bunch of ways, and I'll talk about those. But essentially, if the DNS is not secured, this makes it much harder to operate a secure internet. And DNS and routing are two of the public core two of the services that people often talk about when they talk about the public core of the internet, or they talk about internet infrastructure. And so we're measuring each of those. And just to be concrete, what we're doing is, for each country, we are generating scores. So, for example, the first 4 countries, we're measuring a routing score. We're measuring churn across those, and this was an early capture of the data. And so the routing churn is surprisingly low. We think it might go up as we do more of this. We score the open services, we measure their churn, and we measure DNS and its churn. And you can actually see in these churn columns, there are some changes to those numbers. And so how do we calculate these things? Open services is relatively simple. So for each ASN, we count the number of distinct IPs responding for each open service. And then CISA has a amplification list, and we use those numbers. And we divide that by the number of advertised IPs for the ASN. And so this gives us a score, which can get pretty large, and we'll talk about that. And we do something similar for each country, where we assign ASNs to countries and then do the same sort of math. And so we're looking at primarily a score relative to the size of the entity. Right, that's the advertised IP denominators in each of these equations. Because what we think the absolute numbers are interesting, but the absolute numbers are also going to be fairly highly correlated with the size of the network. And so they are less, I don't want to say they're less interesting, but they might be less illustrative. They're just going to tell us how many IPs exist at some level, not entirely, but so we can look at this and we can measure prevalence, right? So how many IPs are showing an open service in a given region, in a given ASN, in a given country. And we can also assess the incidence of services being open. We can say, this is what's new for this in this time period. And so we are demonstrating how we adapt methods used in public health and bring those to this internet measurement framework. And so one of the things that was interesting as we did the data is these very small territories had incredibly high scores because they have relatively few IP addresses. And so any instance of there being an open DNS amplifier led to a dramatically higher score than larger territories had. And so when we graph this, you'll see that a very small number of countries showed much higher scores. And if we eliminate those tops, I think it was the top 7, the scores were much, what's the phrase I want here? The scores were much in a much smaller range than they were when we looked at the whole of it. And so this graph here on the top 236, which by the way is a log graph, is essentially everything out to the far left and then ignoring the spike. So as we look at these, one of the things that was interesting to me was the ends of this scale, that there are a few countries that are doing exceptionally well. There are a few that are doing sort of badly, but then there was a relatively flat middle to the curve. So on DNS, the thing that I will say, and there's a lot on this slide, in case we want to talk about it in depth, but really what we're trying to do is we're trying to derive an overarching DNS score, and that overarching DNS score needs to account for both positive elements of DNS security, such as the existence of DNSSEC and signed zones, and it needs to account for negative elements such as lame delegations, DNS delegations that have been retired but not removed from the DNS. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to think about the way in which we express that, and we're exploring some ways to express that allow us to create, and what this equation does is it essentially treats it all as a log from minus 10 to plus 10. And that gives us a scatter plot that looks like this, where the majority of countries have no DNSSEC and no lame delegations. And then they were scattered around in ways that we didn't yet have strong explanations for. But when we take a look at this in a separate view, we excluded all the no DNSSEC countries, and we just looked at the number of domains that were covered. And this was interesting because a very small number of countries had more than 50 or so DNSSEC deployments. And that's something that came out of the work. And then again, lame delegations. There were a few outliers that had really, really surprising numbers. And one of the things that was interesting to me about this is this includes, I think that's Indonesia and Myanmar, but it also includes Pakistan, France, and Japan. And those don't seem to me to be a cluster from any sort of policy or economic perspective, right? It's not wealthy countries, it's not less wealthy countries, it's not technologically advanced or less technologically advanced countries. It's a scattershot. And so the reasoning for that isn't something that we've been able to investigate yet, but we did find it interesting to observe. And then when we remove the outliers from the lame delegations, we saw again, and this graph, by the way, is the bottom part of the previous graph. And again, and we sorted it differently, but again, we see a much more statistically typical sort of distribution, right? This is a power fall off sort of curve that we see in lots of things in the world. I'm going to come back to that point in a few minutes. So on routing, we are and again, there's a lot of information on this slide in case we wanted to reference it. But essentially, we are looking at RPKI data and looking to see here, number 5, the percentage of ASNs which have ROA records, which are a routing security tool. And then we do some churn analysis as well, and that we use that to produce a risk number. And here, higher is more risk. And so it was interesting that there were a few countries at the very low risk level, a larger set at the top on the right with very high risk. And then there were some odd discontinuities. The one at 50% is probably an artifact of what we're doing. But then there's this sort of knee in the curve, and there's places where the curve shifts. I just look at this and I want to know why the curve looks the way it does in the middle here. Because my overall question is what causes all of these variants? And I've got to start by saying this might just be random, right? These might be different things. But by the way, at the bottom of this slide, all of these graphs are the outliers removed variants of the graphs. And when I look at all of this, the thing that really jumps out most to me is if these variances are not random, then we can figure out what is causing the variance, right? That might be policy, it might be availability of documentation in various languages, it might be local security regulations, it might be an effect of availability of local technical training or education, right? Maybe one of these is a result of a great professor somewhere teaching people. But what's important to me is the variance creates a possibility that we can understand and influence those causes, that we can actually change these things. And the fact that they are not perfectly random indicates that there are causes that we can probably chase down. And I find that very exciting and very promising. So this is what we have done in phase 2, and we are getting started on phase 3 now. And so some of the things that we're going to do in phase 3, and I'll talk about each of these in a little bit of depth, is we're going to gather some more data. We're going to do a report, or reports, really, excuse me, on the ASEAN countries, and we're going to focus on the ASEAN countries because IRIA, our sponsor, is the Economic Research Institute of ASEAN. Did I get that right, Yuri? And so they care about the ASEAN countries, and we're going to delve into them and see what we learn. We're going to do some work on the scoring approaches to improve those. We're going to do some better visualization work to get better at how we analyze the information and how we share the information. And so there's some other things here. We're going to improve some of the automation that we have for efficiency and reliability, the metrics and calculations, and then the new data is email security certificates and security protocols and services. I'll talk about each of those. Oops. So maybe I won't. Maybe I'll talk about those right here. So email security, we're going to look at things like use of TLS and start TLS. We're going to look at things like SPF and DKIM. We're going to look at the certificates that are actually deployed, looking at things like cryptographic cryptographic algorithms that are allowed, looking at things like key length. We're going to look at security protocols, including versions of things like TLS and SSH that are internet accessible. And each of these is a combination, is selected as a combination of data which we can find via scanning the public internet, and data which ought to be correlated with attention to security in various ways, right? If people are paying attention to security, then these things will be present. And if they're not paying attention, then they are way less likely to be present. And so we believe that these scans will reveal information which is correlated with, which is interesting in and of itself, and also correlated with other things that we care about, which are harder to measure. I'll give you an example of one of these. One of the things that we'd like to be able to measure is multi-factor authentication adoption, but it's really hard with most sites to determine whether or not it has multi-factor authentication turned on, or what fraction of its users have multi-factor authentication turned on, because most sites don't give you a login box that says, please enter your username, your password, and your one-time password all on the same screen. So we can't just go and scrape that. We'd have to successfully log in and then see what happens. And that's not a scalable test. The other thing that we are doing is we are thinking more about what scores look like over time. So we've been gathering phase 2 data back to November 2022, and we've been gathering phase 1 data since 2017. And so we can start to think more about what does it look like to be looking at these scores over time. How do we visualize that? As we try to aggregate it into something, how much do we pay attention to churn? How much do we pay attention to positive trending? All to produce a score which is accessible to someone who doesn't want to spend time reading through the math that we're doing. And so we think that's a very important, very challenging set of things, and that we're going to be looking at as part of phase 3. Another thing about the phase 2 scores is they are intentionally dissimilar for the goal of getting people to give us feedback. So, for example, the routing scoring, we mark as 1 to 100. The open services is 0 through n, where n can be pretty large, up into the hundreds of thousands. And this represents damage potential, but it also represents a different sort of scoring. And then DNS, as I mentioned, we have both positive and negative that we're rolling into the same thing. DNS scores are also log scaled. Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? We think it will be easier to answer that question when we have some historical data that allows people to think about it not in an abstract sort of way, but by looking at a graph and saying, this is the thing that I want to see in that graph. Can we display that graph a little bit differently? And what does that look like? And how do folks respond to it? So we plan to do some of that work. Okay, so I did have this here. I mentioned that we're adding email security certificates and security protocols. And actually, we got to see the prototype email security tool yesterday. So that was an exciting little bit of progress. It's got to see that yesterday. That's a backup slide. And so on the next steps, we're planning to use the IHMF to inform policy design, right? This work is being done for an economic research institute. We're talking to various folks about what this looks like at the public core, and we're trying to say, how do we make this useful to you to understand the state of the world and understand how the choices that we're making influence that state of the world. We're also planning to start sharing out the data at some point via publication, via less formal data sharing processes in the meantime. We're eager to find more collaborators. That the foundational work has taken a lot of time figuring out how to not boil the ocean while also getting to meaningful sorts of statistics has been a long process, and I think we're making very, very good progress on it. And so talking more broadly, finding the right partners is also a part of phase 3. And so, the other next step that I wanted to mention is next month here at this workshop, Irving Lachow of MITRE is going to be talking. So if you want to mark your calendars for Irv for next month, I'm excited to hear what he has to say. And with that, that's the state of the Internet Infrastructure Health Metrics Framework today. I am happy to take questions that you might have. And I'm going to stop my share, but I will resume it if there are sort of questions that are like, bring up some slides.
Adam, I just shared, thank you for that. I just shared on the chat text box that overall framework, the sort of philosophy of what is public health, what we are measuring. It's not the risks against you, but the risk posing to others. That type of paper is on this link. And if you go to the CyberGreen and go to this research site, there are relevant papers that we did, all listed, uploaded there. So one of it is IIHMF. Method paper on these 3 components is not publicly available yet because we are going to the validation process for the next month. We're going to validate the scoring systems, the method, the coding, the data. So after we finalize that validation process, we're going to upload that. But if you are interested, our method, happy to share that. So please let me know. In fact, this is so small group, and I know everyone. Hey. So I am going to share that method over here. It's on the Dropbox. So I'll share that link. How's it going, Art? How's it going, Bill? How's it going, Dan? And approve.
I'm excited to be part of this group. This is turning out to be really special, and
this is a special group, Approve. you know, Dan is from the philosophy stage, he's involved, and Art Manion now are you at the CISA at the moment?
I'm a contractor for CISA.
Oh,
Yes, technically.
so is playing a very important role of the vulnerabilities management. Bill, of course, from Google. He is one of the person who's been involved to this model. I mean, he's one of the person who has a very similar idea of applying public health approach and a data-driven approach, vital statistics, data sharing into applying that approach to cyber. So it's a great group, small, a super great group. Just to say that.
Thank you, Yuri.
Yeah.
So what are we gonna do now?
Well, Art clearly has the best office.
Yeah, that's right.
It is a nice day out, and I have my mother-in-law's gazebo with the beautiful birds in the lovely garden. Yes, I have a great office right now.
Nice, nice.
No side noise. I mean, I have a sort of a question, but it's a little off, maybe off topic. Do you mind? Yeah. Okay. So hang on. Okay, that was shooing away the children. I've been trying to measure, I'm going to call it software security, which turns out to be tricky. Lots of efforts and attempts to do so. I think I'd call it a different angle or different thing than CyberGreen is currently doing, I think, but not unrelated also. But and I end up just possibly trying to measure behaviors or practices or performance of software producers or suppliers or vendors or maintainers. I've not figured out a great way to do it at scale yet, right? You can't port scan things or, check DNS or DNS or routing data or anything. So, I mean, I'll just sort of say that, and I realize I fully appreciate that's not anything Adam, just talked about or I'm familiar with going on at CyberGreen, but I'll still ask any thoughts or plans on other things to measure. I heard the email, email security, DKIM, some nice observable things I heard earlier on the way. And I don't have an answer here, or else I'd be trying it. But any thoughts on what else might make sense to measure? I mean, I love the public health approach, analogy, but I'm having trouble measuring this bit of it.
So such a simple question. I should have an answer off the bat.
Oh no, I mean,
no. So
I know some of the people in this group have worked on this. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we could think about is things like command and control pings, right? Lookups to, for example, we've got some relationships with some of the big DNS operators. How many times do they say NX domain because it's on somebody's deny list, right? That's a health indicator. And the thing that makes that sort of complicated is the layered resolvers problem, where if I have a corporate DNS server, say at CISA, then I'm getting a subset I can't see how many machines are querying to the public DNS server. And I can't see how many of the queries that should have been coming in are getting cached. Now, do those matter? Right? Are those the data is invalid as a result, or are those the data is skewed as a result? And Dan, of course, who's here, has commented that it's perfectly fine to measure with a badly done yardstick as long as you use the same badly made yardstick all the time.
Right.
Which seems highly relevant to both of those. And you know, when I think about doing this sort of scanning at scale, some of the relationship, you know, I think about what Mudge and Sarah were doing. And for those of you who are not art, they had built a pipeline to do a bunch of tests on binaries to see things like, does it have various memory protection techniques enabled? Was the binary signed? I forget what all they did. And they were doing some scoring. And the relationship is when I think about, you know, for example, is a piece of software secure? There's both the direct, is that piece of software secure? And then how widely deployed is it? So thank you for the Cyber ITL link there. And so, for example, if there's a bug in, I don't know, I'm looking for an unusual piece of software that I use, Wire an encrypted instant messenger chat, which I am probably the only person on this call who has the Wire client installed versus Zoom or Microsoft Office. How do we think about that from a public health perspective, right? We've got one instance of a thing, but it's deployed in a lot of places.
Yeah, on the sort of where it's used or how many are there, I'm a pretty big SBOM proponent, and I have hopes that should that data become more available, we might get better sort of prevalence or counts of things. I also, you know, and that's certainly an interesting idea. I also bump into, hey, there's this one thing or this one thing that's very, very infrequently used, but guess what? That's enough for the initial access or whatever led to your compromise. So we have the problem of, yeah, they didn't use Microsoft Office. They used, I don't know, Wire, right? Something with low distribution, but you know, anything could be the attacker's way in, and that's a classic sort of problem as well. Not the prevalence is not a great measurement, but I get in discussions with people who say, yeah, this is the most prevalent, therefore it's always the most important. Yeah, until you get hit by the non-prevalent thing. So
since I don't work for the government, I can say SolarWinds is not very prevalent.
Or AD manage engine. CISA, there's a joint thing that came out yesterday, and I always just Control F for CVE in those.
Okay.
And it was great to see there were CVEs from 2021. Manage engine, I believe Manage engine is similar to SolarWinds in that you install it on top of your Windows network, and it is an entire additional layer of management and full system control over your entire Windows network. Surprise, an adversary might be interested in that. And you didn't patch since 2021, so I can't, like, no one can help you, so sorry. Anyway, for instance, Manage engine is also possibly prevalent and clearly used in attacks. So
yep.
Yeah.
So going back to the SBOM thing.
Oh yeah.
how should we be thinking about, let's presume that SBOM is widely available for everything,
Sure.
and when it is,
Yes.
what do we look to decide on public health style risks based on that, right? How does that data lead to this project getting, or some variant of it getting better?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. My belief is, should there be enough available data and it's consumable and parsable and everything, you should be able to get better prevalence. So I'm not sure what the public health equivalent is, right? This portion of the population, this demographic, this country, I'm not sure country might be possible, has, I don't know, a characteristic, a propensity for something. A lot of, Windows being installed is not a surprise, but something there, some dependency there, some highly prevalent use of something, such that when there is a bad bug or an incident involving that thing, you'd know that they were lit up for it. But in advance, I don't know. You might be able to get to a monoculture-ish argument or a diversity analysis. I don't know. I'm kind of also thinking if the dependency part of SBOM works, it might reveal things we already sort of know, like this library or that encryption library or this thing is behind everything else. And you might peel back some layers of dependency and see what sorts of things are used. But I don't know if that, if that alone indicates health or not. And what I'm thinking is the CyberGreen, right, public health thing. Yeah.
But so I just put a note, like, if you think about, like, we did this human genome project 25 years ago, right? And it was done in order to build a base understanding of the composition of humans generally, right? We now have better genomes mapped and more diversity out there, but it was like, let's build a map. And it was a necessary step in order to better understand genetic variants that led to genetic-based disease. And it's almost like, what would be the equivalent of, the computational genome? So is it the SBOM universe of existing deployed software? Like, what is the big computation? Because if you look at it, you go, well, we don't really know what is good, what is a good state and a bad state, because we actually don't know the state, right? So it's kind of like what we're kind of looking at health in the way that we looked at health of human populations before we knew the genome. And so we kind of look at it computationally in the way that we did, which is we observe, we try an intervention, we see if the intervention kills you or doesn't. If it doesn't kill you, then and you live, then I guess it worked, right? And now we get to a point where what we could do is be much more dialed in to the point where we can actually now, because of the Human Genome Project and because of computational methods, we can now create three-dimensional protein models based on base sequence pairs. And so we can sit there and say, hey, I wonder what a protein would look like that could alter this particular disease state. Well, we couldn't get there to that kind of engineered state, and we're not done, right? We couldn't get to that engineered state until we actually understood the composition of the genome so that we could understand variation, understand the behaviors, build a model. And today people use those genomes as a way of studying variation so that they can actually determine whether or not it's a meaningful variation relative to a disease. And we're kind of coming at it in maybe, in some respects, I look at the IIHME as HMF as the the piece of it related to the high level service architecture for the services. But what we're missing is like the individual components of what is the actual composition of the stuff that we compute with. And that's kind of where, when I look at it like SBOMs and that sort of thing, it's like, or salsa frameworks or things where we're kind of trying to get to the underlying component. Like, it's almost to me like we're trying to, it's like we're trying to map the genome. And so when I think about like building a comprehensive library of SBOMs, it feels about as daunting a task as mapping the human genome, like in some ways, right? But it's almost like, you know, if I don't understand the composition of the thing, I don't really know that I understand whether or not I have a control or whether or not I have an exploit opportunity. Like, I don't know the variation, and I don't know if I have this piece of software and that piece of software, if they're actually equivalents. And until I expose them to disease, and then one falls over and one doesn't, I go, okay, I guess they're different. So I don't know.
So, go ahead, Art.
No, just to say, I follow. I have some ideas for what to do if I had SBOM and dependency data in large samples and models, but part of my conviction is let's figure out what we have and then take the next step after that. We don't know what we have, so we're kind of running blind in some areas. That's as far as I've gotten. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So I think if we were to think about what's the bill of materials for this computer in front of me. So rather than thinking about an SBOM being relative to Zoom or Chrome or PowerPoint, we think about what I'm just going to call an S2 bomb here, which is the system software bill of materials, which is it's not quite the union because I've got 32 copies of zlib for sure. But if we think about that, then we could say, here's what this system is composed of. And then, and this is a problem that Bill and I have been talking about a bunch, is what is a disease? Because what we'd like to be able to do is to say, for this S2 bomb, we see these diseases showing up. And Bill, I'm going to dive into the weed level of our discussion for a minute and say this is a counter argument against accounts as the primary.
You're right. It is
thing.
It's almost that accounts is too abstract. Because in some respects, if I thought about like, let's take the application of a control, like where we're looking for the presence of 2FA, let's say. Well, whether or not I need that control and the control's effectiveness at prevention of disease depends on the composition of the thing that's being protected in some regards. So like, there might be, it's kind of like, if I'm missing a gene for coding a protein, it'd be good to know, because disease is when I don't have that gene or to make the protein, and I'm put in a situation in which the protein is needed, right? Like, I can't produce an enzyme that I need to digest something, or I can't produce some response to threat, then I need it. But up until that point, I didn't need it. And so, you know, in some respects, if I know what kind of the baseline normal is, and then I know what a variant is, and then I can, when exposed to threats or in different environmental conditions, I can see which confers benefit. And so it might be that, so for example, sickle cell confers benefit in certain environments, but generally is not good, right? But in certain malarial environments, it actually confers benefit, which is why it's there, right? So you sit there and go, okay, maybe what's the equivalent computationally, right? And I do think, as I now think about it, it's like accounts are probably not right.
So I think
it doesn't get to me.
I think accounts probably is a useful thing to be measuring.
Right.
And if we think about me and acronyms, if we think about account systems SBOMs, we end up with a bad acronym, so we probably shouldn't do that. But the SBOMs of all of the systems which I use, we can have two hypotheses about how accounts are compromised, more than two. But one is that the issue that leads to account compromise is software compromise. The other is that account compromise is a result of credential compromise, in which case the conglomerated SBOMs don't really matter, unless those conglomerated SBOMs have better user interfaces that make it harder to do the wrong thing, like a password manager. So maybe, so I think we can take where Art is leading us to say these agglomerations, and this ties back to your what's the human genome. The SBOM is like the genome, or it's a subset of what makes up the genome. And I think if we had those, and even if we don't have initial access point data, like at the post-compromise forensic level, we might still have this machine had this IOC on it, right? It had this piece of software. And we don't have to be causative. We can just say, okay, this set of things in the system software genome were correlated with this system had to be reimaged. And maybe that's, NTDLL, or maybe it's something a little bit more nuanced. Maybe it's manage engine. Who knows? We don't know what it is. And I'm thinking that things like the term frequency inverse document frequency algorithm, which just finds you weird words in document sets, could be really useful if we had system genomes, because then we could find what the weird terms in those genomes are. And that probably relates to the source of compromise. Because assuming that it is unique to the compromised set, not a broader set.
Yeah. I'm just thinking, like, if you knew that if you had SBOMs of software packages, right, and then you can look across them and say, hey, each of these has, hey, every single one of these has this version of log4j.
Yep.
Compositionally, then you'd know that each has the potential of being compromised in the same way. And then it becomes a question of how exposed is that, what's the exposure of that flaw to the attacker. But you know that at least there is a flaw, a coding flaw that produces a vulnerability. And, and then you could look at like classes of attack. So you could sit there and go, okay, so there's a whole class of attack that, because all of these packages contain common components or common libraries or common code base, they're subject to a large scale set of compromises potentially, unless there's other additional compensating controls or environmental differences. But and then the question could be, okay, so if you have these, the kind of the care that you ought to apply is the following treatment, right? Because this is there's a coding flaw, and we tend to do that after the fact, right? We tend to do that where we announce and say, hey, here's a CV, and everybody goes, holy crap, now we got to respond and scramble, and nobody really knows what they have, and everybody panics, right? And instead, if we were to say, hey, look, there's a series of kind of common code base variants that aren't in alignment with good software development practice or good security practice. And so we have a class across a large swath of, let's say, industrial base. We've got an exposure. Could we preventively say to people, look, there's a weakness that is present in the code base that you ought to go address before you're exposed to potential, threat actor? I don't know. We just lack the ability today to kind of look across, right? So when I think about what I like about what Art described is if we truly had the human genome equivalent of the SBOM for, let's say we could know the composition of all software in existence. Then you could look across the software and try to understand the characteristics of software developed and the likelihood that it is more prone to compromise or disease. I don't know.
So the reason I want to go to disease is we already have an overwhelming problem of people feel that they can't patch. And a lot of that, I believe, relates to they try to do the wrong, it's not the patch application itself, it's the business surrounding the patch application, where they try and do risk management and schedule downtime and all this other stuff. That's the problem. But the advantage in my mind to chasing disease is it lets us say, here's the thing that is actually leading people to get sick. And maybe that's useful. And if we can just count sicknesses rather than vulnerability, then we can focus on what leads to that sickness.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in some respects, you could look at it and say, okay, what was the cause of the disease? What led to that compromised state?
Not patching. Sometimes,
right, but the question then becomes
sometimes.
Which part of the patch made the difference, right? And
yeah,
and in some respects, right, if I think about other sort of public health messages that we deliver to humans, there's a whole bunch of reasons where we can sit there and explain, you ought to have dental appointments, and people don't schedule them. They don't do standard dental cleaning. They don't show up because it's inconvenient or it's perceived to be painful or they can't fit it in. And so, you know, but we know, like, if you do these things, then you're more likely to have these outcomes that are favorable. And we message around that, and we try to get people to do that. But at least we have a pretty clear connection between these actions and that. What we don't really know is the next level down, which is some people simply have very little risk of dental caries because of their dental, because of the dentin and enamel and their genetic makeup. They just don't. They're not going to have them. And so maybe for them, it doesn't actually make sense. So we don't really have very targeted messaging. We don't really know the next level down, right? We just say, hey, we know certain things you ought to do. And that's kind of where it feels like we're at with patching now. We just say, you ought to patch, right? And it's not working. The message isn't working. It's kind of the same thing of like, you need to go to the dentist twice a year. It's just not causing people to take an action which is beneficial for all of us. Not just for them, but for all of us, right? There's a common good here that's not being served. And it feels to me like there's something that's imprecise in the message enough that the benefits aren't being conveyed. I don't know. That's why I like kind of like and it's still kind of floating around in a bunch of loose thoughts right now, but it feels more grippable, actually, Adam, compared to some of the other thinking.
Yeah, I'm loving the conversation. I'm wondering if we should keep going or put a pin in this one for now, because we are at minute 72 of our scheduled 60-minute thing. And I really didn't want to even flag that until a pause in the conversation, but I will flag it now. Art, I did want to mention to you that this whole conversation, years ago, I had a conversation with Tom Millar about doing this sort of thing.
It's a long-standing discussion. But yes,
Yes,
please.
it is. But I think the reason I bring it up is because I think actually it feels to me like the aggregation of S-bomb into some sort of system bomb, S2 bomb, whatever you call it. Alan's better at that than I am.
I wrote that down. Yeah.
Is a new thing that I hadn't heard anyone talk about. And I think it creates a potential map to doing some of those things that we talked about that we haven't been able to do, but now we could think about doing.
Yeah, I had not. So I had a call 13 minutes ago, but this one's much more interesting. That's a backhanded comment for everyone, or compliment. Please take it that way. There's something there, and it had not occurred to me. Thank you I'm glad I called in today. Framing it from the point of view of this system in front of me or that system. I always work the graph the other direction, but that's an interesting way to look at it. There's going to be something. As far as I can justify to anyone, not that you're really asking, right? Knowing what we're running is going to unlock or improve something.
Yep.
I can't think of what all it's going to be yet in advance, but we're running without knowing. So knowing some more has got to help in some way. I'm sure there's going to be some angle here. And I just don't know what they all are going to be yet. But if we can get some of this transparency out, I think we'll have be able to have different discussions, right? This is data we don't currently have. You know, we're not going to get it from scanning all the software from a binary side or a source side, but if we could get the people making the software to let us know what they're doing at scale, at some, it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be perfect coverage or every single thing or always up to date, but I think there's going to be something to come out of this data should we be able to get it. Yeah, I still talk to Tom. I don't work directly with him, but that's always a little bit in flux. So I still see him a lot. Yeah.
Okay, maybe mention this to him, because
Yeah.
I think that as you say, the flipping of the approach might open something up that isn't otherwise feasible, and it may create another use case where we should think about what the mechanism would be for ask a system to give you the SBOM of every package on the system.
Yeah.
How would right? I don't know, for example, if SBOMs are getting packaged into the actual download, right? Is that file there?
That's an
Maybe we
option.
should
Yeah.
Maybe we should push for it as a thing that we want, so that you can do that, you know,
Right.
find
Easily. Yeah.
yeah, you see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, I would say it almost as it opens up with those data. It also opens up the opportunity for the same sort of thing that we see in biological research, which is there will be organizations which will simply start to go look at and trying to understand the variants and whether a variant matters or not, and what its cure ought to be, right? And all of a sudden it kind of fosters, I think, some economic activity around it. But it also allows us to look at broadly, there's some policy associated with it. So if we see it also points to things like the value of diversity versus monoculture. Because all of a sudden that would start to be exposed, because today, you can't really tell. And all of a sudden we find, like in Log4j, there was a lot more monoculture than we realized. And, so in some respects, I think it opens up a bunch of different opportunity, which together with the phase 2 data collection starts to build an interesting kind of picture, because now you're getting, both the stock and flow information, right? You're getting information about just the health of the flow, and you're getting information about the kind of the health of the static stock that interacts with that flow. And it feels like we're filling in a hole. But it's, and maybe the reason why we've seen such reticence on kind of just SBOM adoption is because there hasn't been a compelling kind of reason for it, other than thou shalt do so or else we're not going to buy your software. But it hasn't been, it's been not, broadly made available, like in the way that we would say, hey, there's a public data set of sorts, or a searchable data set like what the NIH makes available today. And maybe that's CISA is the house, the homing place for that, or it's something else that represents the kind of the custodian of those data, or it's this group. I don't know.
Both? Any?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I
Huh.
mean, I think the use case for SBOM is sort of an interesting thing because it's clearly something that customers want, but they don't necessarily know what they're going to do with it. And
Right.
vendors are scared that they're going to misuse it and cause a lot of meaningless runaround. I mean, I remember the whole to-do over the fact that OpenSSL that Apple ships is still like on version 0.96 or something because they changed the binary interface. And so Apple now has their own branch of OpenSSL, which is totally disjoint from the rest of OpenSSL. But if you just look at it from an SBOM perspective and a public database of CVE perspective, you'd be like, holy cow, this thing is an explosion of bad vulns, but it's not really. And so, for example, I would think that Apple would fear SBOMs on the basis that they don't want to be answering questions from people over that. And so when I think about this from the perspective of would companies like to be able to do this? Quite possibly, yes. And there's an argument which I think ties into the shifting the blame doc that CISA released, and also the national strategy about where the cost of dealing with these things is. Of we'd like to be able to do this, but doing this might cause expense for software vendors. And so maybe we're going to see resistance to participating in our medical testing program.
Yes. Yeah. We have just about in the SBOM world pretty much verbatim heard folks, the signs are clear, and some industry, firms or groups have come out and more or less said that, which I appreciate. Everyone's got, if you're selling stuff and want to keep your stuff proprietary, that's choice. But right, if the norm shifts, or possibly a regulatory finger on the scale to sell to government, you got to tell us what's in there. Things may change, and I don't have the numbers on this. I'm not an economist, but it seems to be there's lots of work on the externality problem of, right, everyone downstream is bearing the cost of somebody introducing a bug or not fixing it quickly, or costing more to fix later. We more or less know these things, but haven't found a way out yet, right? And it might be anti-competitive or market, but if we figure out a way to demand better quality and somebody goes out of business, that's how the market works. Like that is a market, actually, right? So, but how to get there, still a bit of a struggle. Yeah.
Yep.